Sealing your watercolor. Is this something you should be doing when you finish a watercolor painting? This is a bit of a tricky subject because anytime we introduce some sort of a liquid sealant onto a watercolor painting, it runs the risk of ruining the painting. And not every artist even seals their watercolor. So today we're going to tackle why you might seal your watercolor, why you might not seal your watercolor, and then we're actually going to be testing 5 different things to see how well they actually perform in the sealing process, and then how well that sealant actually works. Okay, so why might you seal your watercolor? There are 2 main reasons as I see it. The first is to protect it from water damage. Anytime water spills onto a watercolor painting, it can make things run around and it's not a good thing. Now, when you hang up a painting, that's not always a risk because there's not always a chance of things getting splashed on it. But if you live in a particularly humid environment, or maybe you want to hang it in a bathroom, the chances are higher, so sealing it might be a priority for you. Now, the second part is a little more intriguing to me, and that is the possibility of a UV protection. As a matter of fact, one of the ones we're going to be testing today has, or it states that it has a UV protectant in it. Now, why would I be curious about this? And that really has to do with different colors and their light fastness. Now, in any sort of paint, and especially in watercolor, we have something called fugitive colors. And unfortunately, they're mainly pink colors, which are some of my favorites to paint with, and I know there are a lot of other people's favorites as well, but they are the most likely, when exposed to light, to just kind of run away. Hence the fugitive. And what that means practically for a painting, if you hang it especially somewhere that has light exposure like near a window, is that that pink color is going to lighten over time and you're going to lose some of the details that you've placed in. So the idea of having a sealant that has some sort of UV protectant or like an SPF for your painting is pretty exciting because it would keep your pinks pinker for longer. But the question of whether or not you really need to be sealing your paintings is kind of tricky because not all artists do it, including me. I don't really seal my watercolor paintings. And part of the reason is that about 90% of what I paint ends up inside of a sketchbook. And guess what a sketchbook does? Well, since it stays closed most of the time, it keeps it protected from light, so I don't have to be so worried about those fugitive colors. And it also, since it's inside of something, I'm less likely to spill things on it, so I don't really need to take the time to seal it because it's fairly well protected within this. Now, a painting that I really like and that isn't going to just live in my sketchbook, I would frame it, and it would be behind some sort of a glass, which, guess what? It protects it. And if I really was concerned about the fugitive colors, you can actually get different glass to put into your frames that has a UV protectant in it, and so it would accomplish both of those things. Not only that, but watercolor is actually a lot more durable than you might think. For example, if you have a painting and it's completely dry and you were to smudge across it, it's not really going to go anywhere unless you have some very particular paints. I don't necessarily recommend doing that because you're going to be putting your oils on there, and that could affect the coloration on the paper, but it is a lot sturdier. As a matter of fact, I even got really curious about this subject a couple years ago, and I painted 2 different postcards. And one of them I sealed with a wax medium, and the other I left unsealed. And I sent them off to Andrea, who lives a few states away, and they both showed up in pretty decent condition. Both the sealed one and the unsealed one. Now, I don't think either of these got caught in a rainstorm, so we can't really test the water damage part of that one, but they still showed up in pretty good condition, and I probably didn't need to seal both of them. Now, my final reason for not sealing things is, quite frankly, that it is scary. Anytime we're introducing some sort of a water onto our watercolor painting, we run the risk of ruining the painting that we clearly cared enough about to seal it. So the idea of it just kind of frightens me. Now, even though it's really scary, the good news is that I love testing things so much, so it's a good motivation for doing the scary bit of this. Over the years, I've been suggested a bunch of different things quite frequently, and I've also have some ideas about a few things as well that I want to see if they do work and if they will ruin a painting or if they protect it, and then once the painting has been sealed, how well it protects it. And in today's video, the things we're going to be testing are going to be Dorland's wax medium. This is what I actually sealed that postcard that I sent to Andrea. So I know that this at least partially works and does not totally ruin a painting, but we're going to put it in to see how it stacks up against the others. And we're going to be testing Krylon's Kamar finish. And this is actually something I've used on an acrylic painting before, but it does say that it works for watercolor. So we're going to see if that's true. This is the one that I'm most curious about. I saw this one a couple weeks ago. It's Schmincke's, and it is specifically made for watercolor, and it's the one that has the UV protection. So I really hope that this one works, because if it does, we get both of those benefits. And another I'm going to put in here is Hairspray, and that's because this is what I get suggested the most in my comments on how to seal your watercolor. I have my own skepticisms about this, but we'll tackle that when we actually test it. And I do want to make sure that it's in here because this is a cheap and widely available option, so if it does work, that would be great. And the final one we're testing is one that I know for a fact is not going to work with watercolor because it's not made for watercolor. And the reason I'm putting this in here is I want to have something in that will show you why you want to be a little bit careful about choosing what you put on top of your watercolor because you could potentially ruin it. So this one we're not testing to see if it's good for watercolor, we're just kind of using it to show what can happen. And as a matter of fact, anytime you're selecting some sort of medium to use with whatever medium you're using, you really want to check to make sure that it states that it can be used with that medium, because all different mediums have different bases and some of them get along better than others. For example, if you were doing an oil painting and you wanted to put a sealant on top of it, but you chose an acrylic sealant on top of an oil, this is a water base and it's actually going to repel on top of that oil because oil and water don't mix. So you have to make sure that you're always matching the medium with the medium so that it will actually accept and play nicely together. Now, in order to do this test, what I've done is I've actually done 6 different paintings. I have a control one so that we can test at the very end to see how things are protected versus the control. And I'm actually trying to do a variety of things here. The first is I'm writing the name of what we're testing in Sharpie. And I'm doing this because I want to have 3 different types of pens on here because watercolor is often used with different types of pens, and so if you're sealing something, the chances that there's a pen on there is likely fairly high. So we want to make sure that the sealant is also going to play nicely. So I've got a Sharpie here, then I have a Micron that is waterproof, and then I have this other pen that I bought that's basically a knockoff of a Micron that says it's waterproof, but in my own use of it, I know for a fact it isn't, so I think it actually has a different base to this. And this means we're going to be able to see how these different things work with different mediums, including the watercolor. Now, as far as the watercolor, what I tried to do here was get a bunch of different things happening. I have a whole bunch of different colors in case for some reason one of the colors is going to react differently. In theory, it shouldn't, but just in case, we have a wide variety to test here. And then I tried to get different types of brush strokes. So I have some very thin ones to see if we would lose thin lines. And then I have some areas where I have more full coverage, so we would see if we get any spritzing effect. And I also have some areas where I've layered quite a bit of different color on there to see if kind of the saturation of color on the paper is going to matter to the final result. Now, after I repeated this as closely as I could on all 6 of these, I took pictures of these beforehand so that as we run through these tests, we're going to be able to do a very clear side-by-side comparison of how it looked before and after the sealant was applied. And then once we've seen how well these different sealants actually apply, we're going to let them fully dry or cure, and then we're going to see what happens and how well they are actually sealed by putting some water on them. Now, I want to start with this one. This is the one that I'm like 98% sure is not going to work, and it's going to smear and smudge my watercolor painting. Because I want you to see what could potentially happen if you use something that has the wrong base. I do want to make sure that I make it very clear that TriArt is an amazing art brand. They're a Canadian art manufacturer, and they have some incredible acrylic mediums, and I really, really like them. So this is nothing against them. This is just showing that something that has a different base is not going to work well or be compatible with watercolor. As you can see, this is a brush on one, so I poured it on the sides and then I smoothed it over, and anywhere that that's set, it's going to pick up some of that color and it's going to kind of smear it across the page. But this type of scenario is the exact reason that I am nervous about putting any sort of a liquid on top of a painting that I really care about. If you choose the wrong one, things are not going to go well. Now for our next test, we're going to do Hairspray, and this is one that I don't expect to work because this has both alcohol and water in it, and alcohol has interesting effects on watercolor as well as so does water. But this is the one that I have been told over and over again that people like to use, but it is the scariest option for me. So as I spray this on here, you can tell right away that as soon as that liquid hits that page, it starts to kind of bleed and kind of seep into the surrounding areas. Now, the reason I think this gets suggested so often is that this is one of those first kind of tricks that you get when you're in an art class, especially if you're doing graphite paintings. Hairspray can be used very well to kind of seal in things that have particles like graphite so that it doesn't run away on a canvas or on your page. But in the case of watercolor, hairspray is a no-go for me. And next up we have our Dorland's Wax Medium. Now this is again something that I have used in the past both on watercolor and I've used it on gouache too. It is a bit of trouble to use though because it is a wax and resin that can be used on top of things. Since it says resin, I don't like to mess around with any sort of resin, so I am going to put some gloves on. And the way that you apply this is you take a small amount, put it on some sort of a cloth, and then you're just going to rub it onto your page very lightly. This takes a bit of time to get it nice and spread out and nice and smooth, and in some cases you might notice that this does slightly darken the colors that you put it on top of, as well as if you rub a little bit too hard or too much on an area, it can start to pick up that color just slightly. You can see on the paper towel that I'm using here, I got a little bit of this blue, but it doesn't really show up. You can't really see any sort of damage, but you can pick up a little bit of that color. Now the next two I actually had to do the other day because you have to do this in a well-ventilated area. I'm not doing that down here in my basement that has one small window. So I actually did this in my shed and I made sure that I opened all of my windows. And then I personally, when I'm applying some sort of an aerosol sealant, I like to wear a respirator as well, just as some additional protection. To say I was pretty nervous on both of these because as you're spraying any sort of liquid on, just like the hairspray, I was expecting to see these kind of bleed and spritz and run all together right away. So first up, let's do the Kamar varnish. This one I actually did make sure to read and follow all of the instructions on the back of the can, and I was pleasantly surprised. Everything stayed nice in place and it didn't seem to make any changes to the watercolor painting that was below it. The instructions on this can actually specify to spray this in really thin layers to help reduce the risk of smudging and bleeding, so that's what I did. However, on one side of this, I sprayed a ton of it because I wanted to really put it to the test to see if it was going to actually bleed if I just overloaded it with this product, and it didn't. And then our final one was the Schminke, and this is the one that I'm most excited about because it has that UV protection in it. And it didn't have any instructions on it, so I went ahead and actually just followed the same ones. I followed the directions from the other can. I figured it's another spray aerosol. And in general, spraying this on the watercolor did not seem to have any impact on the watercolor itself, so that is great news. Similar to the previous one that I tested, I also overloaded an area with a ton that wasn't just a nice thin layer. You can see it moving around here, and it also did not make the watercolor underneath it bleed, so I am pleasantly surprised by that. However, as this sat, I noticed that it did have kind of a strange effect on the Sharpie. And so that does make me a little nervous because I like to paint with mixed mediums when I'm using watercolor. So I would be curious to do some more tests maybe if I planned on using this to make sure that different mediums didn't have a similar effect with this sealant. But with watercolor, as it says, it works pretty well. Now comes the scary part where I'm actually going to put these sealants to the test. So I've got my spray bottle of water here and I'm actually going to spritz all of these. And I'm going to start with this control. I made this specifically for this so we can actually see what's going to happen when we spray it with water. You can tell as soon as I spray it, things start to happen. When I take a paper towel and try to wipe it off, it just smears it all around the page. It's picking up that different color, and it is not good. So this doesn't happen that often, but there is always a risk of this happening if you do leave things unsealed. But let's see what happens on something like this final finish, which didn't do so well to our painting underneath, but part of the reason I selected this is I knew it would make a waterproof barrier. So when I spray it on here, guess what? Nothing happens underneath it, and when I wipe that off, you can tell that the paper towel is clean, so it's not picking up anything additional. This type of a sealant is not good for actual watercolor painting, but this is the type of sealing action that ideally we would want to go through all the trouble of actually sealing a painting. Next up we have Hairspray. This one surprised me a bit because it did end up having a bit of a sealing effect compared to the control. But when I wipe up the water here, you can still see that it is indeed smearing and picking up some of that color, so it ruined it in kind of both the application and then in the actual protection process, so this is not something I would recommend. Next up, we have the wax medium. It's wax, so unsurprisingly, when you spray it with water, it beads up, and guess what? We can wipe it right off and it doesn't do anything underneath it. So this is a good solution for keeping things nice and waterproof. It's a great moisture barrier. Next up, we're going to be testing both of our spray varnishes, and these ones, I'm really curious to see how this does. I do think that maybe I should have done a couple more coats. So if there is some lifting here, it might just be because I need to get more coverage and I need to do more coats, but we need to see how it stacks up against the other ones. For the Kamar varnish, when I spray this, I feel like you can see the little spots that don't have full coverage almost right away, and it is picking up some of the pigment from those areas. However, the parts that have more coverage seems to be, well, more covered with water protection. It's definitely better than the hairspray, but not as good as the wax or that final finish. Onto the Schminke. This one has a very similar result to the other spray varnish. I suspect that these did need another coat or two to make sure that they had more full coverage, but they are fairly well protected compared to the control, and I think I might need to revisit this at a later date to see if more layers does give it more protection. Now we do have one more option that I didn't prepare a control for because I'm actually quite confident in this one. So much so that this is a painting I want to keep and that I like, and guess what? If I spray it with some water, it's fine. I can wipe it up and nothing happens to anything but on top of that glass. And that's a big reason why I don't typically seal things, because you're more than likely going to put it behind glass anyways, and it's already going to provide you a lot of that protection without all the hassle. So ultimately, should you be sealing your watercolor paintings? I think that's going to be really up to you. This is a personal choice. It's not something that I think I'm going to do. However, I do like knowing that the option of these two are not going to totally ruin my paintings exists, because I was a little bit too scared to test these. Whether or not they provide as much protection as glass, I'm not entirely sure. I am still quite intrigued by the UV protection portion of the Schminke one, but it is a lot of trouble to do. And I'm somebody who doesn't like a ton of steps to things, so this is probably not going to be my go-to, but I'm not ruling it out. I'm curious to know, do you seal your watercolors, or are you also somebody who finds it to be too much trouble to do? And if you are somebody who likes to seal your watercolors, I would love to know what solution you've found that works the best for you. I hope you're having a great day, and if this video was helpful to you, please consider subscribing to my channel and giving me a thumbs up.